All right, the next part of the lesson also deals with solving. Now, again, solving does not always mean to find a value. Let's say we're given a formula. What does it mean to solve a equals 1/2 times b times h for h? Well, if we're solving really means to isolate or to get a variable alone. So right now, if I'm just looking at this equation, a is what the equation is solved for. So this is the solution for a. Now this is asking us about h. So here's my h. So if we're solving that, that means to get h by itself. So to isolate h. So we want h equal to something. So let's go ahead and actually do that. So if we solve our formula, and if you remember, that's our formula for a triangle, okay, for h, that means that, again, we're trying to get this h by itself. So the same rules still apply, even though we're dealing with a bunch of letters. We want to look at what's being multiplied, if anything, divided, added, subtracted, groups, powers. So all of those rules are still going to apply. So when I'm looking at this, this is all multiplication. So that means to get h by itself, we should be dividing. And we can do it all at once, or we can do it in steps. So I'm going to do it in steps. So if I'm looking at this, if I'm trying to get h by itself, I need to get rid of b. So that means that I'm going to divide both sides by b. So here, it's going to cancel. So now I have a over b, so that's our left side, equals 1/2 h. Well, again, we're trying to get h by itself. So I'm just going to box that again. So I'm trying to get this part right here alone. So now I have to get rid of this 1/2. And again, in between those two, it's multiplying. So and again, we're dealing with a fraction, so we never divide by fractions. So we're just going to take this and we're going to flip it. So that would become 2 over 1, so just 2. Or if you want to write it over 1, that means the same thing. So we have to do that same thing to this side. So 2 over 1. So on this side, again, those things are going to cancel. And we would have here, if we simplify, so 2 times a is just 2a. And then we have 1 times b, so this will be over b, equals, and then that cancels, and now we have h. And then just one more step in simplifying, or whatever we solve for should always be on the left side. So I'm just going to switch these two things around on my equal sign. So we have h equals 2a divided by b. So this would be our solved answer for h. Now, when we are dealing with a bunch of letters, we do have to be careful with what we're substituting in, because what number can't we divide by? That number would be 0. So we cannot divide by 0. So this is really important to remember. So when we are dealing with multiple letters, we have to state a restriction. Okay? So if I'm looking at this problem right here, I have b in the denominator. So that means that if I start substituting in numbers, I can't substitute 0 into this spot, because then we're dividing by 0. So my restriction for this problem is b cannot be, so it's an equal sign with a slash through it, and then 0. Now when we state restrictions, we use the original problem as well as our answer. Okay? Now in our original, we don't have any variables in a denominator, so we don't need to worry about it. So restrictions only apply when we have variables in the denominator of a problem. Okay? And again, that's both in the original and your answer. All right, so let's do some more practice of these kind of problems because they're a little more difficult. So we are solving equations for the indicated variable, and then we're going to state its restriction. All right, so for problem 11, we have a equals 1/2 b times h. So we don't have any variables in a denominator, so we're not going to worry about restrictions for the original part. And then this time we are solving for b. So I'm going to, again, kind of mark which letter I'm trying to isolate. So I'm trying to get that B by itself. So again, when we're looking at this, even though there's letters, it's the same concepts. We're looking for addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, any powers. Okay. So here, this is all multiplication. So that means to undo it, just like we did up in this problem, is we're going to be dividing. Okay. And again, you can do it in one step or in 2 steps. So I'm going to go through it the long way. Okay. As you get better, you can start doing more steps at the same time. So again, we are trying to solve for B. So we're not going to move that one. We're going to move everything else. So let's start with H. So since it's multiplication, that means that we are dividing by H. So here it's going to cancel. So now we have A divided by H equals 1/2 B. So again, we're trying to get B alone. So now I need to get rid of this 1/2. So just like before, we're going to multiply by its reciprocal. So we're going to take both sides times 2. So now we have 2 times A divided by H equals B. So our B is alone. So I'm just going to rewrite it in the proper form. So B equals 2A divided by H. And then since H is in the denominator, that means that we can't substitute 0 in. So we have to say that H can't be 0. So all of this is our answer. All right, so next one, we are solving for H. So again, I'm just going to mark that. All right, so now when we're looking at this, typically we would start distributing here to get rid of our grouping symbol. But in this case, we don't actually want to do that because it'll make the problems much more difficult for us. So if I'm looking at this, this is actually all multiplication right now, which makes it really nice for us because we just have to divide by stuff. So I'm going to start with the 1/2 this time. So again, instead of dividing by our fraction, we're multiplying by our reciprocal. So that means that we're taking both sides times 2. So now we have 2A equals H times the quantity of B sub 1 plus B sub 2. So I don't know if you guys remember this, but this is actually the area formula for a trapezoid. Now again, we're trying to get H by itself. So that's this variable right here. We're trying to get that alone because we're solving for H. So between H and this group, it's multiplication. So to undo multiplication, we divide. And we're allowed to divide by this whole group. So I'm dividing by B sub 1 plus B sub 2. And if it helps, we can include the parentheses, but you don't actually need to. And then again, this side, same thing. So B1 plus B sub 2. So this whole thing is going to cancel itself out. So now we have 2 times A divided by the quantity of B1 plus B2, and it would be equal to H. Now we know that H needs to be on the left, so I'm actually just going to write it like that right away. So H equals in our group here. So now we need to worry about our restriction. So the denominator, we have 2 things in it this time, and since they're both variables, the easiest way to write it is to say that B1 plus B2 can't equal 0. Now let's say it was a letter. So just kind of as a side note over here. Let's say we ended up with a fraction of A over B plus 3. Now for this restriction, if I substitute in -3 here, so let's just say I have -3 plus 3, that gives me 0. Well, I can't divide by 0. So the restriction for this one would be B cannot be -3. So really when you're finding restrictions, you're taking whatever the denominator is, setting it equal to 0 and solving, and then you just say whatever you get for your answer, it can't be that. Okay. So again, let's go back and just circle our final answer here. So all of this is our final answer. All right, next one. So again, this time we're solving actually the same equation, but this time for b sub 1. So here's our answer right here. So now, since it's inside of our grouping symbol, we're actually going to approach this just a little bit differently. So again, when we're looking, right now, it is all multiplication here outside this group. So since it's multiplication, and we're trying to get something inside of our group to be alone, we're actually going to divide first. Okay. Now, we don't want to distribute in, because that'll make it a lot more difficult. So instead, I'm going to divide everything by h. Okay. So now we have a divided by h equals 1/2 times the quantity of b1 plus b2. And again, we're trying to get b sub 1 to be alone. So now we have to get rid of that 1/2 out in front, and when we do that, that means that we can also drop the parentheses, which will help us. So now I'm going to take everything times the reciprocal, so everything times 2. So now when we do that, we have 2a divided by h equals b1 plus b2. So again, we're trying to get our b1 alone. So now we have this b2 left, and since it's addition, to undo addition, we subtract. So now we're just going to subtract this b sub 2 to each side. Now I can't combine it with anything, so that means when we write it, it's going to be 2a divided by h, and then outside of our fraction, it's going to be minus b sub 2. And again, that's going to be equal to b sub 1, so we canceled that out. So again, I'm just going to write my b1 on the other side, so I don't have to rewrite the whole thing again. So b1 equals all of this is our answer. And then our restriction, we have h in our denominator. So if I substitute 0 in for h, we can't divide by that. So that means that h cannot be 0. So all of this is our final answer. All right, last one. So this one's a little bit different, because if you notice, it doesn't tell us what letter to solve for. So this is going to be 4x. So that means that we need to get x by itself. So when we're solving, if you notice, we only have one letter. So here we have 2 letters, but we can't just combine those together, okay, because we don't know what the numbers are. So in this case, we have to think about kind of all of our rules that we talked about earlier. So how do we go from 2 letters back to 1 letter? Well, we need to think about our distributive property, right? So let's say that we were dealing with, just kind of as a side note over here, let's say we had x times a plus b. So if I'm looking at this, I have 1x, and if I distribute it in, that means that we're multiplying. So we would have ax plus bx. So I'm starting here, and I need to be here. So we're going to do the reverse of our distributive property. It's actually called factoring. We're going to factor out the x. But it's only from these 2 right here. We don't really care about this 15 right now. So whenever something looks like this, you should always have factoring as part of your work. Okay, so we're going to factor out the x. So when we take the x away from this group, we would have an a left. From this group, we would have a positive b left. We still have the minus 15 equals 3. So again, we're trying to get our x by itself. So my next step, I'm going to add this 15 over. So now we have x times the quantity of a plus b equals, and then 3 plus 15 is 18. Well, now between my group, so my x and my group, that's multiplication. So to undo multiplication, we just divide. So we're going to divide by that whole group. So those 2 things cancel out. So now we have x equals 18 divided by a plus b. And since we have letters in the denominator, we just say whatever the denominator is, so a plus b, since they're both letters, can't be 0. So all of that is our final answer. And that's going to conclude lesson 3.